Welcome back to Second Breakfast. We are talking about Game of Thrones today, even though we have been diving helms deep into the world of Arrakis.
We sort of accidentally became a Dune podcast on Tuesdays only.
Well, no one can forget Tyrion Lannister's famous quote, "The mind needs books like cheese needs a grater."
Yes, that's it.
And
he says, "Fear's the mind killer."
I've been living up to that mantra by diving headfirst into Dune. If you didn't see, this last week we did our first Dune episode. I think this week we did our second Dune episode. Not totally sure about the release schedule, but we are talking about each book in the Dune novels. I'm running through it. It's sort of complicated there because the first book is divided into 3 books.
Yeah, it's Lord of the Rings all over again. It's
we're doing a lot of Dune episodes, so go check those out if you haven't. It's a big fun journey, but we are still
because we did tease that as one of our series we were going to do. Yeah, and instead of doing a chapter by chapter thing, Cam just happened to be reading the book, and then we decided to talk about them in a more overarching way and in a spoiler free way, at least as far as we don't spoil anything past the first movie. So if you want to check that out, it's over there.
Yeah,
enjoy.
We've already recorded all of those for at least the first 3 covering the first novel.
Yeah, we have.
We obviously did that episode on the first Dune movie, and I'm sure we'll do one about the second movie when that comes out next
Unless
week.
we despise it, we're going to do it.
There's no shot.
Yeah.
We've got Dune fever over here, but I am enjoying the pivot back to Westeros.
Me too. I really love
this episode. We're continuing our long happy death march through George R. R. Martin's magnum opus. Today's discussion is going to be about Tyrion 2.
Yeah, 2.
Which is chapter, 12 or 15.
So far, I've had no trouble keeping track of how many characters have done what. When we start to get into 3, I'm going to lose my mind.
3 is too big a number?
I think the next one is Catelyn, and I think that is Catelyn number 3, so I'm going to have a rough time of it. But it's fine. We're doing great. Okay, so how about I give a quick recap of this chapter and then we can dive into our discussion. If you haven't been here before, number 1, hi. Number 2, I recommend you check out our other Game of Thrones discussions because we build upon what we've been saying. Number 3, we spoil everything. Cam's read all the books. I've read some of them. We've seen the whole show. Things are going to be spoiled, especially in this one. Just a little hint, I'm going to spoil a big old thing and talk about it a lot. So keep that in mind. Okay, so this is a Game of Thrones Tyrion number 2. Tyrion is on the road to the Wall with Jon Snow, Benjen Stark, and 2 of his Lannister men. On the way, they also meet up with another Night's Watch brother named Yoren, who has brought with him 2 youths who are going to the Wall. That is because they are criminals who have committed some pretty atrocious assault crimes, and it was either be castrated or go to the Wall. So, of course, they're going to the Wall. And it is very, 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 very cold. George makes a big point to point that out. I mean, mostly because Tyrion is from the south. He's used to King's Landing, so it's very cold for him.
It was 85 here in Texas this week.
I don't even want to talk about it.
It was nice reading a book about the cold.
It was. I was like, oh, it's February. It's winter. Huh. Okay. Anyway, so they're on the road, and on the 18th night, they've been traveling a lot, while the other men are kind of setting up camp. Tyrion, who is no help to anybody in setting up things, he's too small, too in the way.
He has fellas for that.
Yeah, that's not what he does. So he takes a skin of wine and a book, and he goes off to read alone. And I love this for him. And the book is one that he borrowed from the Winterfell library, with Ned's permission, of course. And the book is about the history of dragons. And so while Tyrion is reading, we sort of get to dive into Tyrion's mind palace and learn about some Westerosi history and also just some of Tyrion's own history. So Tyrion has always been fascinated by dragons. When he first went to King's Landing, when Cersei was marrying Robert, he immediately went down to the crypts to see all the Targaryen dragon skulls. And he was so excited just to look at them and spend time down there. Dragon skulls, we learned, are black and shiny, and they're of course impervious to and love the fire. And we learned that the oldest skulls down there are 3,000 years old, and the youngest and the smallest skulls are 150 years old. So it sort of suggested that the dragons got smaller and smaller over time and eventually died out. The smallest skulls are no bigger than the skulls of 2 dogs, 2 mastiffs. We also learned some more history of Westeros. So Tyrion has an ancestor named King Loren of the Rock, and this story happens about 300 years before our current story, and this is back when the 7 kingdoms were actually kingdoms and not just basically states of
Provinces,
the U.S.
Yeah.
Right, they were their own thing. So he's king.
Canada.
Right.
Canada used to be a kingdom.
Did it?
7 different kingdoms.
That's right, Cam.
Now it's just French bullshit.
Bring it back. So King Loren of the Rock had allied with King Mern of the Reach, and they were going to fight against the Targaryens because they were sort of trying to take over everything. And they went into this battle, and the Targaryens were like severely outnumbered, but they brought 3 huge dragons with them. 4,000 men burned that day, and that battle is sort of known as the Field of Fire. Luckily, King Loren escaped, surrendered, and pledged fealty to the Targaryens, and of course lived long enough to have a son, which is why Tyrion is alive. So he's like thankful for that. But that sort of gives us a sense of what the Targaryens were like, what kind of damage the dragons can really do when they're used to their full potential, especially when you have 3. Ding, 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 ding.
And 3 of the biggest ones. Because
Yes.
the point of like the ones that had the smaller skulls is that they were killed earlier.
Right.
But also there's a suggestion that they were kind of inbred. So this
Yeah, they're
is
all
in-
deformed, and yeah.
This is the glory days where dragons are living long enough to be full grown and massive.
Right. It also gives us a sense of what the Targaryens are like. I mean, not Targaryens, Lannisters are like. Like they, they have strength and like want to accomplish things, but also they will kind of give up and surrender when it benefits them. So that's interesting.
Finger
to know.
to the wind.
Yeah, right. Very Slytherin of them. So he's reading, and then all of a sudden, Jon Snow kind of appears and pulls Tyrion out of his reverie and asks Tyrion why he reads so much. Tyrion gives this fantastic monologue that's now really famous, but the main line is...
The cheese thing I mentioned earlier.
Yes, it's the cheese thing. He says that Tyrion's like, look at me, like I can't hold a sword, I can't ride a horse, I can barely ride a horse, I can't my weapon is my mind. And he says, and a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone if it is to keep its edge. AKA it needs a cheese grater, as you said. And so then they start to talk about dragons. And Tyrion says that he used to fantasize about burning his father and sister when he was a boy. And he's sort of like taunting Jon because Jon is like very shocked. And Tyrion's like, surely you've had similar thoughts about your family. You're a bastard. And then he's like being really sarcastic and mean. He's like, I'm sure Catelyn is so nice to you. And like Robb is like your best friend. And
because you're not a threat to him.
Right. And then this just upsets Jon more and more. And Tyrion taunts Jon about being, quote, like packed off to go to the Night's Watch. And then he's like talking about how not noble the Night's Watch is. And then Jon gets upset. He's like, the Night's Watch is a noble calling. And Tyrion's like,
it's a prison colony.
He's like, that's not true. You've seen the guys you're traveling with. You know what you're getting into. And Jon gets more upset and is like almost close to tears. And then suddenly Tyrion feels kind of guilty. And so he goes up to try to comfort Jon, but then Ghost appears out of nowhere and knocks Tyrion off his feet. And he's like, it like causes his back to spasm and he can't get up. And so then Jon sort of gets a little bit of revenge and like taunts Tyrion a bit and says like, I'll help you up if you ask me nicely. And so like this interaction basically evens them out. And after this, they both become a little bit friendlier to each other and they develop a like kind of joking, sarcastic rapport with each other. The way that like good male friends do, where they like make fun of each other, but like in a way that it's understood that it's like okay on both sides. And they go back to camp together and eventually everybody heads to bed, but Jon takes the first watch. So he's still up, looking out, making sure everybody's safe when Tyrion goes to bed. And that's it.
Really fun chapter.
Yeah, it was really fun. Honestly, like not much, really not any longer than any of the other ones, but there was just a lot to cover. I think that history about Tyrion's ancestor was kind of crucial. So that's why I included it. And all the dragon stuff is really fun. Also, I'm going to talk about it later. So there's also that.
Yeah, I want to start with the character of Tyrion.
Yeah,
because both of his chapters have been so much about other storylines while still developing him as everyone's favorite character. He's irresistible in a way, but it already feels like George knows that.
Yeah.
And there's a certain restraint in how Tyrion is used. From the very beginning, he already feels like an MVP guest star. The Emmy for Best Supporting Actor.
Right.
And I really like that sort of restraint, how you trot out characters very carefully and deliberately, because it means that expectations are managed. We're not expecting, even with that kind little hint last time when we saw him and Jon together, I don't think anyone's expecting Tyrion to end up on the throne.
No, yeah. It's
even
really
when,
not.
Even
not
when the show
think.
was on and the whole cultural zeitgeist was about predicting and theorizing and talking about the show, I don't ever remember people arguing that Tyrion's going to end up on the throne.
No, I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, felt like he would be a good person to be on the throne. Like he would... like for the most part, be really well suited for that. But we just know it's not going to happen.
But you felt like he would be involved.
Sure.
And I think that's interesting.
I mean, he thrives the most in his Hand of the King role.
Right, that he would be in the entourage.
Yeah.
So he's not a protagonist, even though he's maybe the most sympathetic person we've gotten to know so far.
Certainly, yeah.
I want to define him as sort of being a bridge character.
Okay.
So far, in both of his chapters, he's been used to develop more traditional protagonist characters like Jon Snow.
Sure, yeah.
But I think the evolution here in his second chapter is that he's also really developing Dany in absentia.
Yes.
He's filling in her family history with the book he's reading.
Yeah.
While also giving some of that knowledge. And again, we talk about this idea of him giving this germ of the gargoyle thing to Jon. And Jon then ran with that through his own chapters. I feel like Tyrion reading about Targaryen history somehow transfers over to Jon, because Jon ends the chapter staring into the fire like Tyrion did when he was admiring the Targaryens.
Yeah, sure.
So again, he's kind of giving that bug to Jon. And that means him as a bridge character, if we're looking at what he links together, he's the bridge between ice and fire.
Yeah.
And somehow we get this sense of foreboding or foreshadowing that he's going to have his own place among them.
Yeah, okay.
If Jon and Dany come together, it feels like, well, yeah, Tyrion should be there.
Of course he should, yeah.
He would make sense of things.
Well, especially if we know that the way that Tyrion is like sort of acting in like an advisory mentor role with Jon here, he's going to do the same with Dany much, much later. So that mirrors really nicely.
And you get all these other links, these other smaller bridges that Tyrion facilitates. You get within the Targaryen history, there's that little note about bones from the dragons that are used and prized by the Dothraki as really good bows.
Yeah.
So there's a tiny, almost in the minutia of history, you get this tiny little bridge between the Targaryens and the Dothraki.
Yes.
And that strengthens Dany's storyline.
Yeah, absolutely.
And gives it a stronger sense of history. In the same way that we've seen Tyrion almost literally act as a bridge between the establishment and the future. Because he enters the story as a voice of the Lannisters, but also as the guy who's always in the library, reading up on old history and transferring it to the new generation. He's the person who angrily tells Joffrey to go visit Bran and pay his respects.
Yes, right.
So he's trying to facilitate some of those bridges between the old nobility and the traditional great houses.
Yeah.
While also, by going to the Wall, forging first-hand contacts with people at the Wall.
That's true, because like King's Landing is so literally removed from the Wall, and you really need somebody to sort of explain what it's like up there and like actually have eyes on it. And
So-
not just be this abstract thing.
Exactly, but also then he has friends there. Then he can ask for favors.
Yes, right.
Maybe he can get some intelligence from what's happening at the Wall in the way that an unnamed, faceless authority figure in King's Landing wouldn't. So he's doing all this bridge work, and that makes me sort of question how I initially wanted to characterize him, because none of this work feels like that of a passive gargoyle character.
On the outside, right.
This all feels like Vulture work.
That's very true, yeah.
So do we elevate him to that status? What do we think of how Tyrion sits in the narrative after getting to know him a little better?
Well, I think my response is I think what my response was a long time ago when we first when we've been talking about this is that people see Tyrion as this gargoyle. They see him as an outsider, as somebody who, doesn't really have an effect, like isn't allowed to participate in regular society in all the things that everybody else participates in because he's so different. But I think he, in this delightful Lannister way, is acting in this Vulture capacity, but under the rug. People don't really actually understand how much of that bridge work he's doing, how much he is really plotting. I mean, nobody thinks he's dumb. Everybody knows he's smart. Like, he's not surprising people when he does something clever. But I think I know people underestimate Tyrion, and I don't think they realize how much of a vulture he really is, because he gets to sort of hide behind the guise of the gargoyle. So I think that that was sort of my answer a few weeks ago, and I think that's even strengthened by what you're saying here.
Because he's not just the guy in the library. As we see here,
Right.
even when he's on the road doing 3 other tasks, he sort of is the library.
Yeah.
and brings that with him.
He's the keeper of all that knowledge. Yeah.
So I'm enjoying that new depth and growth already just between the 2 chapters we've seen him in.
I like that. Well, I also like that the way that this chapter plays out, we get to see how much of an effect Jon has on Tyrion. Not that Tyrion's role changes, but that he is sort of like undergoing some personal development on this journey. Of course, like going up to the north, like going through this like bitter cold in this wilderness that he's not used to is going to have an effect on anybody. But I think what changes, or maybe that's too strong a word, what affects Tyrion the most here is his conversations with Jon. I noticed early in the chapter, in the span of like 2 pages, the phrase "no doubt" happens like 4 times. The narration says, "No doubt they made a curious fellowship for the King's Road. No doubt the boy had made the mistake of thinking the Night's Watch was this noble thing." And then Tyrion says to Benjen, "No doubt you'll find some place to put me." And then it says that Benjen had offered Tyrion his fur, quote, "no doubt expecting him to graciously decline." So Tyrion is like described as this person who has no doubt. Of course, he is very sure of himself. He's very smart. He understands the world around him. He understands the people he's with. He understands his place and everything. But then when, like, after his interaction with Jon, first of all, Jon sneaks up on him, and so does Ghost. So that sort of already like unsettles Tyrion's certainty about what's literally around him. And I think that even like the more that he talks to Jon, he's literally thrown off by Ghost. He throws him off his feet. And then he feels, when he feels guilty about Jon, it says he feels absurdly guilty, like implying that it's this unexpected feeling that Tyrion doesn't often have. And like they sort of like develop this relationship that I think is pretty rare for Tyrion. He doesn't get close to people. The only person he's close to is Jaime, and even then that's very complicated and messy. And I think that this sort of, the way he relaxes and is sort of like feeling pretty sympathetic towards Jon is really unusual for Tyrion. And even like when he's looking at Jon's face, it says that it was a face that gave nothing away. I think that's rare for Tyrion. He's good at reading people. He's good at understanding what's happening. And so I think this connection he has with Jon is unique and is starting to maybe make him have some doubts when before he had no doubt about anything. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, it's a compelling new friendship. Yeah. And I think for Tyrion, it's the first person he's spent a lot of time around who isn't someone he hired or someone else in the aristocracy.
Right.
Who always wants something from him.
Yeah, he's not used to somebody who is below him in station but not working for him.
Almost no agenda.
Yeah, right.
Or at least not in that geopolitical sense.
And he's already identified in their first meeting, he identified that they are very similar. They're both like being like these outcasts, like calling like bastards are equivalent to dwarves, you know?
And that similarity is something interesting. I have a point on friendship if you want to do that. So last week we talked about Ned and Robert, and you asked an interesting question about the almost the arc of their friendship over the years, because we get all these glimpses of the past when they were boys, when Ned was freshly married and Robert was winning his throne, and then we see them now sort of decayed and calcified in their ways.
Right, and Ned is just totally not opening up about anything and is holding everything back, and there's no actual communication between them anymore.
Right, it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
They have the shared memories, but they don't have that communication anymore. Yeah. There's a distance they can't seem to close.
Which happens to a lot of adult friendships. It's very
sad. Of course.
Yeah.
And I think here we're continuing that idea of friendship, but we're seeing it from the other side. In the same way we talked about that discussion of age almost jumping the fence to go from this older examination to seeing the youngest forms of it, with the Stark children being thrust into these different roles and having to grow up too quickly. I think we're now jumping the fence to talk about male friendship. Instead of advanced middle age, we're now going back to the first days of knowing someone with comparatively younger participants.
Yeah, I don't know how old Tyrion is. I know he's younger than Jaime and Cersei, and they're not that old. So presumably he's in his 20s. So he's not that old.
Interesting. I never thought about that.
Yeah, Peter Dinklage is obviously not in his 20s. So we always view Tyrion as like 40 years old, but I think he's like in his mid to late 20s.
Okay. Yeah, and Ned and Robert, they are Robert.
Robert, not this again.
I completely forgot we did that until that 1 second.
If y'all don't know, that's the way that Cora on Downton Abbey, Cora says Robert, and it's always driven Cam crazy. It's so funny. Well, mostly your mom hated it, but
that made
anyway.
me so happy.
I'm so happy. Robert. If you hate Cora Crawley, leave us a comment below. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, we get to watch that bond being developed here. And I think the interesting point that's being made in both generational links here, between the older men and now between the younger men, is that male friendship develops unevenly.
Yeah.
It's not linear, it's not clean, it's not even often kind. There's that harshness, there's the humor, it's almost adversarial.
Right.
And I think that makes it as mercurial as it is fascinating. And so much of it, when male friendship is depicted in a way that rings true, so much of it is unspoken. So much of it cannot be articulated. And if it was clearly articulated between the two parties, it wouldn't work.
Right. There's not a lot of them saying, "Oh, I love you. I care for you.
No.
You're my best friend. I'm always here for you." It's
Right.
mostly just like, "Oh, you kind of look like a grumpkin," or whatever Don says.
Exactly. Exactly. And I love watching that bond develop here between Jon and Tyrion, because for me anyway, I've had experiences with male friendship, and this rings true for me. This feels accurate in that it is constantly a little bit on the rocks. Like there is that ribbing, but I mean, there's pretty open conflict here. Ghost attacks Tyrion. Jon's like screaming at Tyrion in the course of their conversation. Tyrion refuses Jon's help when he falls down, even after they've had the moment of warmth.
When they're walking
closer.
back to the camp, like Jon's trying to help him climb over some of these roots and stuff on the ground, and Tyrion's like, "No, leave me alone."
So he refuses his help, and he's physically attacked. But Jon will take Tyrion's advice and his wine.
Yes.
Like there's that beautiful contradiction as these relationships develop. And
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Well, I was going to say, especially because they're both such independent men or people. Is Jon a man? He's a child.
Isolated.
Right. Like they both know they have to make their own way. They both know that they can't rely too heavily on other people. And they're both stubborn and strong-willed and want to, go through life with as much independence as they can because of, their outcast status. So it makes a lot of sense.
And maybe to advance the conversation from the question you asked last time, which was, has the Ned and Robert relationship changed? In this context...
Don't worry, he'll be dead soon. We won't have to do it much longer.
Me?
No, Robert. Me saying to the listener, don't worry, he'll be dead soon.
A brief aside.
Sorry, go
but
ahead.
no, with the benefit of hindsight, having read the books, having seen the show through to its conclusion, does the Jon-Tyrion relationship change or calcify or sour in the same way the Ned and Robert one does?
Well, it's a little unfair because they become separated for a long time and then are no longer in communication. But I can't remember how long Tyrion is at the Wall.
Well, Ned and Robert don't see each other for the whole early arc of Robert's reign. That was Ned's whole point when he came to Winterfell.
Well, that's true. But they did grow up together, so they had years and years to develop a friendship.
Sure.
But okay, so that's fair. They become separated. I don't know, because I don't think so. I think it's going to become, based on what I remember,
stronger.
Obviously the show goes past the books, so it's hard to say, but I know that in the show, they come back together in the end. And I think that it becomes stronger. Yeah. Because they're able to be separated for a long time and sort of go through their own shit and come back together, I think it actually makes them stronger. I think also when Tyrion is reunited with Jon much later, he has Dany with him, and I think that sort of bridge, Dany's kind of the bridge there, but because Tyrion is acting as the bridge between Dany and Jon, I think that again strengthens Jon's relationship with Tyrion, because he's remembering how much he likes him and how much they have in common and how helpful he is. And I think that helps appeal him to Dany even more. So I actually think, no, it doesn't do the same thing that Ned and Robert's relationship does.
I think there are a couple major factors that differentiate these relationships. The big one is that Robert was never in the Gargoyle Vulture conversation.
Right.
Jon and Tyrion both are.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Robert and Ned are too different from one another. Jon and Tyrion are very similar. I mean, they are very different in a lot of ways, but they've got stuff in common that I think helps keep that strong over time.
And the most important difference between Ned and Robert that soured their relationship is the most important similarity between Tyrion and Jon that keeps the relationship strong. Neither of them ever become king.
Oh, yeah.
And that
Yeah.
preserves a more even footing that can be more honest.
That's true. Because part of the reason Ned and Robert, we talked about this last week, part of the reason Ned and Robert's relationship has calcified and become fraught is because they've grown up, priorities have shifted, time has passed, blah, blah, blah. But really what it comes down to is that Robert is king and Ned is not. And the power dynamic makes things too complicated.
Because they both have this sober outsider's perspective, when Tyrion says to Jon, when he's complimenting him, observing the way that he reacts to bad information, he says, most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like it could characterize their later interactions as well.
Sure.
I don't think either of them grow past that.
Yeah.
I don't think they put themselves out to pasture like Robert does when he wins the throne.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, they're both too hungry. Not necessarily for power, but for just to do what they think is the right thing or to continue to influence the right people. Like, they don't give up the way that Robert's like, okay, I'm done. Neither of them do that. So that helps.
Like you said, because they are going to separate pretty soon for a long time.
Years.
That's why I wanted to zoom in on this early formative part of the relationship, because that's what they're going to lean on later.
Right. I think the other complicated thing is that, we just said Tyrion's in his 20s, so how old is somebody in their 20s? But in this world, you're a full adult in your 20s. Jon is still a child. And so by the time they reunite, Jon will have become a man. He'll have grown up very significantly. And so I think that allows them to come together even more and maybe even be more, not vulnerable, but connect more with each other because they're both adults when they reunite. So I think that makes sense.
Totally. So the other big thing we wanted to talk about for this episode is Jon and Dany. And I know you have some more Targaryen stuff to get into. Maybe I can set the table for that.
Yeah, you've got like one thing, right?
Yeah, I've got one big link. I was trying to zoom out and sort of see how we're doing with the ice and fire linkage here. And I noticed one link between Jon and Dany in this chapter. It's strange because Jon is he's on screen. He's having the conversations here. But Dany is in Tyrion's mind. He's in the history that is coloring most of this chapter.
And Dany's name is never mentioned, but of course the Targaryens are, and her history is mentioned. So that's what's always so fun about these connections. The way that like Sapkowski would make us think about Ciri or Yennefer, even if their name wasn't mentioned on the page, So we're getting a lot more of that in this chapter and the chapter we just read last week.
And if you zoom out enough, in very different ways, but sort of similarly, Jon and Dany are both given new family in this chapter. And they both get pretty brutal additions to the family tree. Jon gets these awful new brothers in the Night's Watch that are going to be his family once he hits the wall and takes the vow. Dany gets these new ancestors who we're learning about, and that gives us some of the only information we have about the Targaryens. And it's that they are brutal war criminals burning thousands of people with massive nuclear weapon dragons.
Right.
So they're both, they still both feel sort of innocent and idealistic, but they have these horrors now in their family. Possible warning signs about where their arcs are going to go. Possibly just threats surrounding them or haunting their minds. And similarly, they're both living with almost unreal, mythical characters from their family sigils.
Oh, okay.
Because now, after the last Dany chapter, Jon has Ghost with him, the direwolf, and now we have seen Dany get the dragon eggs.
That's true. Interesting. That's fun.
And as these mythical creatures are settling into their lives, it's interesting how neither of them seem to process or understand that. Like the immense advantage that gives them.
Yeah, how significant that is. Right. Like Jon just sort of treats, he has like this deep connection with Ghost and he knows that, but he just sort of treats Ghost as like almost this like casual assumption or like just this extension of himself. He's not recognizing how like I've got a dire wolf. Like, that's a huge deal. He's just like, yeah, it's his ghost.
An attack dog if I need one.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and Dany doesn't understand that the dragon eggs are going to hatch real dragons, obviously.
And change her life, right? And change her fortunes. But it's interesting, even that Jon, his sigil, who's with him, is alive, not like trapped in an egg that everyone thinks is dead.
Sure.
So he has the dire wolf with him. So he should believe in these things more, right? He should see like, oh, supernatural creatures are entering the world again. That's compelling. We should put a post-it on that.
Let's pay attention, yeah.
But he's the one who's giggling and scoffing at the idea of Grumpkins and Snarks and the others.
Yes, that's true. And he and Tyrion both say, dragons, there are no dragons anymore.
Right.
Like, they talk about dragons as this distant thing in the past, and they both agree there are no more dragons. So that's interesting. They've got this like really realistic way of looking at it, but Jon doesn't even clock that his own companion is part of that magical realm. That's really interesting.
There's such a grounded realism in the way this story is being told. I like that the characters almost seem resistant to the fantastical elements.
Yes, right. And I mean, that's what I love about this world, is the way that he includes magic in his story, he being George, is that these people are looking at magic much in the way that people nowadays do. I mean, it's a little different because in our world on Earth, most people don't like agree that actual magic has never existed. Like, it's not a thing of the past, it's a thing of just stories and invention, right? But even when, like, we see all the time in like horror movies, when, you know, if it's like a haunted house horror movie, something spooky is happening, of course the human reaction is to attribute it to anything besides the supernatural. I mean, you see that in Harry Potter, right? Muggles refusing to like acknowledge or recognize magic for what it is. Like, oh, it must have been, I shrunk the sweater in the wash, or something is
Trick
just
of the light.
Yeah, whatever, right? Like, we won't actually see magic, you know, as it is. Of course, like, there is no magic, but in the canon, right? And
in the canon of life.
Yeah. But in this story too, people think magic as in magical creatures, any like weird whatever magic that like Melisandre's going to do later, right? Like, that's not real either. Yeah, it's of the past, but it couldn't possibly be happening now. So even when this dire wolf has these pups and like they find these dire wolves, they're like, okay, it's just, I mean, they recognize that it's a dire wolf. They're not like, it's a big wolf. Like, they know it's a dire wolf, but they won't recognize the magic in it. Yeah, that's there's like a resistance to it that makes it feel so, I don't know, true and real and relatable as a reader. I really like that about this world. I certainly noticed a lot of Targaryen stuff, and I'm pointing it out not just because it's fun, but also, again, because it is about Jon's. It's just these wonderful hints towards Jon's true parentage and his connection with Dany. So of course the stuff you talked about is definitely there, and I love that. And I mentioned earlier the like little mirroring of Tyrion being this bridge. Like, here he's an advisor to Jon, and he'll later become the same thing for Dany. And even at the end, like, Jon's like looking into the flames. But the thing that really stuck out to me was when Tyrion is talking about, you know, in the narration in his head, he's remembering when he was looking at the dragon skulls. And it says, the most recent dragon skulls were also the smallest, a matched pair no bigger than mastiff skulls, and oddly misshapen, all that remained of the last 2 hatchlings born on Dragonstone. They were the last of the Targaryen dragons, perhaps the last dragons anywhere, and they had not lived very long. And that felt so prophetic to me. Like, these last 2 dragons of the Targaryens, right? So I was like, okay, who are these last 2? My first thought was that it's Dany and Viserys, the last 2 dragon hatchlings of the Targaryens, right? And of course, like it says, like, they didn't live very long. We know that Viserys is going to die pretty soon. And we also know that Dany is going to be reborn pretty soon. She dies in a sense and like is reborn out of the ashes and becomes this new person.
I know
right?
where you're going.
Right? So that, I think that is one thing that we could read this as. Or we could read the last 2 dragon hatchlings as Dany and Jon. Jon is younger than Viserys, so technically he and Dany are the last 2 Targaryens. And if we, you know, Dany's reborn, and so is Jon. In a few years, Jon is going to die and presumably be reborn. That goes past the books, but we assume that that is what happens.
We've seen
in the
it.
Canon, right?
Yes.
So, and so then I was like all excited. I was like, where were all these characters born? Because it says the last 2 dragons born on Dragonstone. It doesn't work, unfortunately. Dany was born on Dragonstone, but Viserys was born in King's Landing, and Jon was born in the Tower of Joy, which is in the mountains of Dorne. So neither Viserys nor Jon were born on Dragonstone. So the exact, like, it's not a 1-to-1. It doesn't exactly work, but
Are prophecies meant to be one-to-one?
Well, right. And I just think the last two, like, come on. Why would you have the last two? Why not the last one or the last three? Or I don't know. Like, it felt so significantly mentioned and described. So again, like the last Targaryen dragons, perhaps the last dragons anywhere, and they had not lived very long. In the show, I was like, does Dany die? Yes, Dany dies. Jon kills her, at least in the show. And so again, she's not going to live very long. She's still a young woman when she dies. And Jon, at the end of the show, doesn't die, but he sort of kills the Targaryen part of himself.
And then he stares into the flames as the dragon melts the Iron Throne.
That's very true. And then, like, that is the end of the Targaryens. So I just thought that was delightfully prophetic, and I really liked it. I'm also intrigued by, like, that they're, like, misshapen and stuff. I don't know what to make of that. I mean, part of it makes us think about all the inbreeding of the Targaryens, but Jon is not inbred, at least not directly. And Dany doesn't seem to be, she doesn't have any birth defects or anything. So I don't know if that's just, I don't think there's anything to make of that, but I think it's interesting. I mean, I guess it just hints at the potential madness of the Targaryens and that misshapen way of viewing things.
Viserys feels a little inbred.
Oh, well, yeah, 100%. I also, what was I going to say? I don't know what I was going to say, but it's fine. Anyway, it's just really, really interesting. And I was struck by that. And those connections, like, when you first read this and you don't know about Jon's parentage, it's just like, oh, cool, Targaryens, like, fun history. And now you read this and you're like, how did I miss this?
Right.
It feels so obvious to me. Did it feel that way to you?
It felt inevitable because I know what's going to happen. And I think that's maybe why I started seeing these bridges everywhere, because I see the foreshadowing of this being early on. When George is decades away from writing the scene where Tyrion meets Dany. But you can see that. You can see those seeds being planted here. And they feel like ambitions. Yeah. They feel like faraway prophecies. And when they come to pass, they will be different. He's a different writer 20 years later.
Right,
so that's how I'm choosing to read all of this.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be to the letter, but the overtures,
it's there.
You still sense.
Right. I'm also noticing, remember how I said I think you titled it these Targaryen checkpoints, like how each of Dany's chapters sort of marks a new section of the overall novel. Dany's chapter was 2 chapters ago, her second chapter that kind of like marks this new section of the book. Last chapter was Ned, and we did a lot. We had our first like overt reference to Dany and Khal Drogo in that chapter because we got the message from Jorah, who's acting as a spy. And in this chapter, we get a lot of no like overt Dany references, but lots of Targaryen references, like,
and Targaryen Dothraki connections.
Yes, right, in a way that we haven't before. So I really do think that second Dany chapter that we read a few weeks ago, so far, is really marking this new portion of the book where things are just a bit more connected. Even though, interestingly enough, the whole group of Starks has set off in different directions. So things are becoming connected as we spread out. I guess like that's what's forming the connections, is literally spreading out and being less isolated and insular. Speaking of isolation and insulation, we talked a lot about that when we did our Lord of the Rings coverage.
Yes, we did.
I found a really fun little Lord of the Rings nod. So when they're traveling on this road, it says that there are 5 men, 3 boys, and a direwolf, and then like some horses and birds. No doubt they made a curious fellowship for the King's Road, or any road. Cam, what is 5 plus 3 plus 1?
Ooh. Well, earlier you said you couldn't count past 3. So how dare you give me such a complex math problem?
It's 9.
It is 9.
How many people are in Tolkien's fellowship?
9.
Exactly.
That's beautiful.
I just thought that was really fun.
Sure.
Like, well, what do you make of that sort of, like, why invite that comparison? Like, we know that Martin is very familiar with Tolkien. We know he's
at least his middle names.
That's true. We know he's pulling from and reworking, and I mean, he's making his whole new thing. Like, Game of Thrones is very different from Lord of the Rings, but there are obvious connections and parallels. So why invite such an overt connection? What do you think about that?
I think it almost feels like a checkpoint where it marks the contrast. You don't have the best of every group gathered together with their ambassadors to lead the noble hero on a quest.
Right.
You have a bunch of horrible people and two guys who are doing their best
Right.
as they're ground into the dirt.
And this is just part of our larger cast of important characters. This isn't everybody. Yeah.
I think it helps you see the scale and the shift.
And I had like an excited moment where I was like, ooh, can I like draw, like obviously like Tyrion's the dwarf, so he's Gimli. And then it fell apart. And I was like, oh, it actually doesn't work if you try to do one-to-one, because that's not what he's doing. I think what he's doing here is what you're saying. He's inviting that comparison, if only to distinguish himself from what Tolkien was doing. Like everybody's setting off on this journey, but it's gonna go all these different ways. And like this journey from Winterfell to King's Landing is really not that significant. Like it's significant for Jon. Mm-hmm. It's significant for Tyrion in a way, but it's not like significant for the overall plot of the story. Like this journey lasts a couple chapters. It doesn't last the entire book the way that the Fellowship's journey does in Lord of the Rings.
And if you set up these comparisons to be quite overt, and then you pivot really hard from them, you invite the audience to make those comparisons, and then you throw them into the unknown, and that is very narratively exciting. I think it's exactly what he did during the Winterfell era with the Macbeth comparisons.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, so he's doing these fun comparisons, but inviting you to distinguish and make differentiations between things, and then be excited about where it's going to go, because we don't know.
Another dense, rewarding chapter.
Yeah, again, another chapter that was not about Tyrion. It was about Jon. I mean, it was about Tyrion, but in the way that like every time we have a chapter from one character, we learn about them and somebody else. Like last chapter, we learned a lot about Robert, which is great because we never get a Robert chapter. So.
The history and melancholy of these last two chapters, being the first two of this new era after the Targaryen checkpoint, I'm really enjoying the tone and flavor of them.
Me too.
And next week, going back to Catelyn, I'm sure we'll get more of that too. I'm very excited for that.
Me too, yeah. Well, let us know what y'all thought of this chapter. Anything that we discussed, anything you think we missed that you think we're wrong about, or you want to build upon. If you're on YouTube, you can comment below, or if you're on Patreon, you can also comment. Otherwise, if you're just listening, you can send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. We often read out listener emails, and we love hearing your feedback and like to expand upon your ideas and theories. You can also message us on Instagram, Second Breakfast Pod. And I mentioned the Patreon. We have a Patreon. It's $2 a month. You get a bonus episode every month, sometimes more than one, where we talk about all kinds of other things. It also supports the show, and you also get access to the back catalog of bonus episodes as well. So lots of fun things over there. Am I missing anything?
No, we'll see you on Tuesday with a brand new Dune episode.
Yeah, we sure will. So yeah, read up, because
we were gonna spread those out over a few months, but
we were like, let's just
Dune fever.
Yeah, I mean, and we you read through the book so fast.
Yes.
We recorded all those episodes really quick.
Oh, yeah.
So we're like, let's just get them out. It's fine. But we've got like a bunch of Tuesday episodes that we've recorded like a month ago that are not going to go out till like April, but it's fine.
I have the show scheduled through the end of April.
Yeah, we've got a lot. Here's a teaser. A lot of it is a lot of gaming episodes.
A lot of games.
There's a lot of games, so get excited for that. Okay, well, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week.
We'll see you on Arrakis.
Yeah.
And then back here in Westeros.
And then back here.
Cool.
Sand and snow, all kinds of things.
Have a good weekend. Thank you very much for listening. Toodles.
Bye.